The world had turned white in a way that did not feel pure. It felt empty. The sky and the land had blurred into one endless silence, and the wind moved through it like something searching for a name it had forgotten. Across that vast, frozen breadth of earth, a woman walked. Slowly, carefully, as though each step needed permission. Her shawl, once a soft brown, now carried the pale dust of snow and time. It clung to her shoulders like a memory that refused to let go. Eliza May. The name once belonged to a home filled with quiet laughter, to mornings warmed by coffee and the low hum of a man who sang without realizing, to evenings where the world felt small in the gentlest way. Now it belonged to the wind. She did not rush. There was nowhere to go that would welcome her faster. The town had closed its doors not with anger, but with something colder. Indifference, a quiet turning away that left no marks and yet bruised deeper than words ever could. A widow, they had said, as though the word explained everything, as though it settled her worth like dust on an unused shelf. She had knocked on one door longer than the others. The shopkeeper, a man who had once smiled at her when her husband stood beside her, a man who used to weigh flour with careful hands and speak kindly of small things. His eyes had changed, not cruel, just tired in a way that made room for nothing extra. He had listened without really hearing. Work, she had asked, or just a corner to rest until the storm passed. His gaze had drifted past her shoulder, already moving on to something more useful. Winter is not a season for charity, he had said softly, as if softness made it less final. And then the door had closed. Not slammed, just finished. Eliza had stood there a moment longer than she should have. Not because she expected it to open again, but because some part of her needed to understand how something once warm could become so quietly distant. She did not cry. Grief had already taken that from her. It had come weeks earlier, in a smaller room with dim light and the faint scent of medicine that could not heal. Her husband's hand had rested in hers, lighter than she remembered, as though even his strength had begun to leave before he did. He had looked at her with the same gentle steadiness he always had, as if nothing about her had changed. "Stay warm, Eliza May," he had whispered, though the room itself had been warm enough. It had not been about the room. It had been about everything that would come after. She had nodded then, because promises feel easier when the world has not yet taken everything. Now, walking through the endless white, she wondered if warmth was something that could be lost forever. The wind answered by rising. It came first as a whisper along the ground, then a voice, then something louder, sharper, as if the sky itself had decided to come undone. Snow began to fall. At first, it drifted gently, almost kindly, like feathers settling where they pleased. But kindness does not last long in a place like this. Soon it thickened, turned heavy, blinding. The path beneath her boots disappeared. The horizon folded into itself, and the world became a spinning silence where direction no longer mattered. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little. The cold was not just outside. It moved through her fingers, up her arms, settled deep in her chest. Each breath felt thinner than the last. She kept walking, not because she believed she would find something, but because stopping felt too close to surrender. Her steps slowed, then faltered. The wind pressed against her, as though urging her back, or perhaps urging her down. She could not tell the difference anymore. Her thoughts began to drift, not in panic, but in something softer. She saw a flicker of firelight, a table worn smooth by years of quiet meals. Her husband sitting there, leaning back just enough to make the chair creak in a way she used to scold him for. "You'll break it one day," she had said once. He had smiled. "Then I'll fix it." Simple words, simple promises, the kind that made the world feel steady. Her foot slipped. The snow beneath her gave way just enough to steal her balance. She dropped to one knee. For a moment, she stayed there, not from weakness, but from a strange pull of stillness. The cold seeped faster when she stopped. It wrapped around her like something patient. She closed her eyes, just for a second, just to rest them from the white. The wind howled louder, as if protesting, or warning, or grieving. She did not know, but something inside her, something quieter than thought, stirred. A small resistance. Not loud, not strong, but present. Her eyes opened again, and through the blur of snow and wind, she saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a shape that did not belong to the endless curve of the land. It stood crooked against the storm, small, fragile, almost as if it had been forgotten and left behind by the world itself. A cabin, if it could still be called that. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of snow. The walls leaned just enough to suggest they had been standing longer than they were meant to. But it was something, and in that moment, something was enough. Eliza pushed herself up. Her legs protested. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. But she moved, step by step, toward that quiet, stubborn shape in the storm. The distance felt longer than it should have. Or perhaps time had begun to stretch in strange ways. The wind clawed at her, tried to turn her, to erase her path before she could finish it. But she kept going, because the alternative no longer needed explanation. When she reached the door, it resisted at first. Frozen at the edges, reluctant to open, she pressed harder, not with strength, but with the last piece of what she had left. The wood gave with a low, aching sound. And then, silence. The storm still raged outside, but inside the air felt different. Still, heavy, untouched. She stepped in and closed the door behind her. The darkness settled around her slowly. Dust lingered in the corners. Old, forgotten things rested where they had been left. A table, a chair, a stove that had not known fire in a long time. It was not warm. It was not safe, but it was shelter. And sometimes, that is enough to keep a story from ending. Eliza leaned against the door for a moment, her body trembling in quiet waves, her breath uneven. She looked around the small, silent space, as if trying to understand why it had been left behind, or why it had waited. Her lips parted slightly, and in a voice barely louder than the wind beyond the walls, she whispered something. It might have been a prayer, or memory, or simply a word meant for someone who was no longer there. Then she sank slowly to the floor, drawing her shawl close. The storm roared on, unfinished, unforgiving, but inside that fragile, forgotten cabin, a small, quiet pause had begun. And sometimes, a pause is where everything changes. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, through the cracks in the wood, through the thin, uneven lines where the world outside still insisted on being seen. The storm had grown tired sometime in the night. Its voice, once fierce and restless, now rested in a distant hush. Eliza stirred where she had curled against the wall. For a moment, she did not move. Not because she feared the cold, but because waking felt unfamiliar, as though she had not expected to return. Her breath came slow, visible in the faint light, a small cloud rising and fading, proof that something inside her still remained. She opened her eyes. The cabin revealed itself in pieces, a ceiling worn thin by years of weather, walls that held more memory than strength, a narrow window half veiled in frost. Nothing about it promised comfort. And yet, she was alive. The thought did not come with relief. Not immediately. It came like a question, as though survival itself needed meaning before it could be accepted. She pushed herself up slowly. Her limbs resisted, stiff with cold and exhaustion. But they obeyed. There was still work in them. And work, she remembered, had always been a kind of quiet salvation. The room was smaller than it had felt in the dark. A table stood near the window, one leg slightly shorter than the others. A chair leaned against the wall, its back cracked but holding. The stove sat in the corner, rusted but intact. Everything carried the weight of being left behind. Not in a hurry, not in fear, just forgotten. Eliza stepped toward the table. Her fingers brushed across its surface. Dust gathered beneath her touch, soft and undisturbed. She paused there, noticing the faint marks beneath it. Scratches, lines, the quiet evidence of someone who had once lived here. Someone who had eaten, rested, waited, perhaps even hoped. The thought settled gently in her chest. This place had not always been empty, and perhaps it did not have to remain that way. She moved without deciding to, her hands finding purpose before her thoughts could catch up. She brushed the dust aside, slowly at first, then with more intention, each motion small, careful, as though she feared disturbing something sacred. The air shifted slightly as she worked. Not warmer, not yet, but lighter, a faint space opening where stillness had once been too heavy to breathe. She found an old cloth near the stove, stiff with time, but usable. She wiped the table, then the chair, then the narrow ledge beneath the window. It was not much, but it was something, and something, she had learned, could become enough. The stove drew her attention last. It sat quietly, as though waiting to be asked. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing its edges, testing its strength. There was wood stacked in the far corner. Not fresh, not strong, but dry, left behind for a purpose that had never been fulfilled. Until now, it took time. Her hands moved slowly, learning again what they had once done without thought. Arranging the pieces, striking a spark. The first attempt failed. The second hesitated, but the third held. A small flame flickered to life. Uncertain, fragile, but real. Eliza watched it for a long moment, not smiling, but softer somehow. The fire grew, just enough to warm the space nearest it, just enough to push back the quiet edge of the cold. And in that small, flickering light, the cabin changed, not in its shape, not in its structure, but in its spirit. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt paused, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. She sat near the fire, her hands stretched toward it, not greedy for warmth, just grateful for its presence. Time passed gently, measured not in hours, but in breaths, in the quiet rhythm of something beginning again. It was some time later, when the world outside remembered her. A sound, faint at first, then clearer, the crunch of boots against snow. Eliza stilled, not from fear, but from uncertainty. Visitors did not come to places like this, not without reason. The steps paused just outside, then resumed, slower now, careful. A shadow crossed the thin light of the window. And then, a knock, not loud, not demanding, just present. Eliza rose, her movements steady, though her heart had begun to beat in a way she had not felt in some time. She reached the door, her hand resting against it for a brief moment, as if listening through the wood. Then she opened it. The man who stood there did not fill the space. He did not carry himself like someone who expected to. He stood slightly back from the door, as though giving it room to remain hers. Snow rested along the shoulders of his coat, his hat pulled low against the fading cold. His eyes met hers briefly, then softened, not with pity, but with recognition. "Smoke," he said quietly, his voice even and unhurried. "Hadn't seen any here in years." Eliza nodded. Her words did not come immediately. She was not used to being addressed anymore. "Not like this." "I found it," she said at last. Her voice carried no claim, only truth. He glanced past her shoulder, toward the faint glow of the fire, then back to her. "You staying?" It was not a question that pressed. It rested lightly between them. "For now," she answered. He nodded once, as though that was enough, as though he required nothing more. There was a pause, but it did not feel empty, just unfinished in a gentle way. He shifted slightly, setting something down near the door. A small bundle of wood, dry, carefully chosen. "For the fire," he said, then stepped back again, already preparing to leave. Eliza looked at the wood, then at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said softly. And that was all. No explanation, no expectation, just a quiet offering. He turned then, his steps as measured as they had been when he arrived. The snow held his path for only a moment before beginning to take it back. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching, not because she needed to, but because something in her had begun to notice again. The way a person carries themselves. The way kindness can exist without asking to be seen. She closed the door slowly. The cabin received her once more, but it no longer felt as it had before. The fire burned a little steadier, the air a little warmer. And somewhere beneath the quiet, something new had taken root. Not loud, not certain, but present. She sat again by the fire, the bundle of wood resting nearby, a small gift in a place that had once held nothing. And for the first time since the world had gone silent around her, Eliza did not feel like she was waiting for something to end. She felt, perhaps, like something had already begun. The days did not announce themselves. They unfolded, softly, like pages turned by a careful hand. The storm that had once roared now lingered only in memory, its sharp edges worn down by sunlight that returned in quiet threads. Snow began to loosen its hold on the earth, not all at once, but in small, patient surrender. The roof of the cabin sighed as it shed its weight, drips of water forming a rhythm along the edge. A slow, steady reminder that nothing remains frozen forever. Inside, the fire had learned its place. It no longer flickered uncertainly. It burned with a calm understanding, as though it, too, had decided to stay. Eliza moved through the small space with a familiarity that surprised her. Her steps knew where to fall. Her hands knew what to reach for. Even the silence had begun to feel like something she could hold without fear. The cabin had changed, or perhaps she had. It was difficult to tell the difference anymore. The man returned. Not every day, not in a way that demanded expectation, but often enough that his absence became something she noticed, and his presence, something she did not question. Thomas Hale. She had learned his name not from asking, but from the way another traveler had greeted him one afternoon. A passing rancher, old, bent slightly at the shoulders, with eyes that had seen more seasons than he spoke of. Thomas, the man had said, didn't know anyone took to this place again. Eliza had watched the exchange from the doorway, the way Thomas nodded, the way he did not linger in conversation longer than necessary, the way he carried himself as though the world required little from him, and offered little in return. That evening, she had said his name aloud, not to him, but to the quiet space between the fire and her thoughts. Thomas Hale. It settled gently there, like something that belonged. Their conversations came slowly. At first, they were made of small things. The weather, the condition of the wood, the way the snow melted faster on one side of the hill than the other. Words were not rushed. They arrived when needed, and rested when they were not. Thomas did not fill silence. He respected it, and in that respect, Eliza found something she had not realized she had been missing. Room. Room to exist without explanation. One morning, he arrived with tools. Not new, not polished, but cared for. He set them near the door with the same quiet ease as the bundle of wood he had once brought. Roof needs tending, he said. Eliza stepped outside with him. The air carried the scent of thawing earth beneath the lingering cold, a promise hidden just below the surface. She watched as he worked, his movements steady, unhurried, certain in a way that did not need to prove itself. After a while, she moved closer, not asked, not instructed, just drawn. He handed her a small piece of wood without looking directly at her. Hold this here. His voice held no assumption, only trust. She did. Their hands brushed once. Brief, accidental, but neither pulled away too quickly. There was no spark, no sudden shift, just a quiet awareness, like noticing the first hint of warmth after a long winter. They worked like that for some time, side by side, not speaking much, but understanding enough. By the time the sun began to lower itself along the horizon, the roof stood stronger. Not perfect, but held together with care. They stepped back to look at it. It will last, Thomas said. Eliza nodded, then added softly, so will I. The words surprised her, not because they were untrue, but because she had not realized she believed them yet. Thomas glanced at her then, not with curiosity, not with question, just with a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had already known. Days folded into one another, and with them came small rituals. Thomas would arrive with something simple, a piece of cloth, a better tool, once a small bundle of dried herbs. For tea, he said. Eliza began to prepare meals. Nothing elaborate, just enough. But when he stayed, she would set aside a portion without being asked. They ate in silence at first, then with occasional words, then slowly, with something resembling ease. One evening, as the light softened into gold, Eliza spoke of her husband, not in detail, not all at once, just a piece. He used to hum when he worked, she said. Didn't notice he was doing it. Thomas listened, not interrupting, not offering comfort that would ask her to stop, just listening. It used to bother me, she continued. That it didn't. Her voice paused there, carrying something deeper than the words themselves. I miss it now. The silence that followed was not empty. It held her grief gently, without trying to change it. After a moment, Thomas spoke. There's things you don't know you'll miss, until they're gone. His voice carried no weight of explanation, just truth. Eliza looked at him then, really looked, and in that moment, she saw something familiar. Not the same, but similar. A quiet loneliness. Not sharp, not demanding, but present. You've been alone a long time, she said softly. He did not answer immediately. Then, long enough. It was not a confession. It was not a story, just a fact. And somehow, that was enough. The air between them shifted, not into something heavy, but into something understood. Days later, Eliza found herself laughing. The sound came unexpectedly, light, unrestrained. Thomas had said something simple, something barely meant as humor, but it reached her, and when the laughter came, she stilled, as if unsure it belonged to her. Thomas did not comment. He did not smile wider or draw attention to it. He simply let it exist, and in that quiet acceptance, Eliza allowed herself to continue. The laughter softened into a smile, then into something deeper, something steady. She stood a little straighter after that, moved with a little more certainty. The cabin no longer felt like a place she had found. It felt like a place she was shaping, with each swept corner, each repaired board, each quiet meal shared in the fading light. One evening, the fire burned low. The sky outside stretched wide and clear. Stars scattered across it like something carefully placed. Eliza and Thomas sat side by side, not touching, not speaking, but not separate. The silence between them was no longer something to fill. It was something to rest in, and as the fire settled into a steady glow, Eliza realized something she had not dared to consider before. She was no longer surviving the days. She was living them, and in that quiet, unspoken understanding, something had taken root, not rushed, not forced, but real, like the first green beneath melting snow, small, fragile, and certain in a way that did not need to be named. Outside, the last of winter loosened its hold. Inside, something warmer had already begun to grow. The sky remembered, not all at once, but in a slow gathering of clouds that stretched across the horizon like a thought returning after a long silence. Eliza noticed it in the morning, the way the light felt dimmer, not darker, just quieter, as though the day itself had chosen to speak more softly. She stood just outside the cabin, her hands resting against the worn wood of the door. The air carried a familiar edge, not as sharp as before, but present enough to stir something deep within her, a memory of cold that had once nearly taken her name from the world. Behind her, the fire crackled gently, steady, reliable, a sound that had become part of her days. Thomas stepped out a moment later. He followed her gaze toward the sky. Storm coming, he said. His voice carried no alarm, only recognition. Eliza nodded. She did not step back inside immediately. She let the wind brush against her face, let it remind her of who she had been, of where she had stood, and of the night that had almost become her last. It feels different, she said after a while. Thomas glanced at her. The storm. She searched for the words, but they came slowly. It doesn't feel like something I need to run from. He watched her then, not surprised, not questioning, just present. You're not the same as you were, he said. Eliza let the truth of that settle. Not as pride, not as something to prove, but as something quietly earned. No, she whispered. I'm not. They prepared without urgency. Wood stacked neatly by the door. The roof checked once more. Water set aside. Small things. Simple things. but done together. And in that togetherness, there was a strength the storm could not reach. By evening, the wind returned, not as a stranger, but as something known. It moved across the land with a voice that echoed the past, but did not carry the same weight. Snow began to fall, softly at first, then thicker. The world outside the cabin blurred once more, white folding into white. But inside, the fire held steady, its light warm against the wooden walls, its glow reaching into the corners that had once known only stillness. Eliza sat near it, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She watched the flames, not with the quiet desperation she once had, but with calm. Thomas sat nearby, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough to be felt. The storm pressed against the cabin, wind testing the walls, snow gathering along the edges. A familiar sound, and yet everything had changed. Eliza closed her eyes for a moment, and the memory came, clear, uninvited, the night she had stumbled through the endless white, her breath fading, her body giving in to the quiet pull of surrender. The door that had resisted, then opened, the darkness that had welcomed her when the world had not. She opened her eyes again. The same walls surrounded her, the same small space. But now, there was light, there was warmth. There was someone who had chosen to step inside her silence and remain there. She turned slightly toward Thomas. Her voice, when it came, was soft. I thought that night was the end of everything. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to answer. She continued. I thought I'd lost not just him. Her breath caught gently, but the world itself. The fire shifted, a quiet crackle, and then stillness again. Thomas spoke after a moment. Sometimes it feels that way. His words carried no weight of certainty, only understanding, like standing in a storm with no direction. Eliza nodded, her gaze lowering briefly to the floor. But it wasn't, she said. The end, I mean. He shook his head once. No. A pause settled between them, not empty, but full of everything that did not need to be said. Eliza looked back at the fire. Then, after a moment, she spoke again. I don't feel lost anymore. The words rested gently in the air. Not dramatic, not fragile, just true. Thomas turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. You never were, he said. His voice was quiet, certain in a way that did not ask to be believed. Just known. You were just somewhere no one had taken the time to see. Eliza felt something shift inside her. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but deep, like something long buried finally finding light. The storm continued, but it no longer reached her in the same way. It was outside, where it belonged. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the space between two people had become something more than distance. Time passed, measured in the soft rise and fall of the wind, in the quiet breathing of a place that had once been forgotten. Eventually, the storm grew tired once more, its voice softening, its presence fading into the distance. Morning arrived again, not with force, but with grace. Light slipped through the window, gentle and golden. Eliza stepped outside. The snow stretched before her, fresh, untouched. The world looked new in a way that felt honest. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She breathed in deeply, the cold air filling her lungs. Not biting, not harsh, just clear. Behind her, the cabin stood quietly, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, steady line. A small sign of life in a vast, open land. Thomas stepped beside her. They stood there together, not speaking, not needing to. The silence between them was no longer something to endure. It was something to share. Eliza looked out at the horizon. Then, softly, as if speaking to something far beyond the land itself, she said, sometimes everything is taken from you, so you can find what was never meant to leave. Her voice carried gently into the morning air, and in that moment, it felt like the truth had found its place. The world remained wide, unpredictable, at times unkind, but it was no longer empty, because even in the quietest corners, even in places forgotten by time, there can be warmth, there can be kindness, There could be something that stays. She turned slightly, a small, peaceful smile resting where grief had once lived. And the story did not end there, because stories like this never truly do. They continue, in small acts of care, in quiet understanding, in a way one's soul chooses to remain when it would be easier to walk away. If this story found a place in your heart, take a moment to let it be known. Like it, share your thoughts below, and tell me, where are you watching from? Because no matter how far apart we are, stories like this remind us we are never truly alone. And if you'd like to hear more quiet tales that feel like home, stay a while. Subscribe. There are always more stories waiting by the fire.